All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome as folks log on to J Street's webinar today on a really painful and difficult and complicated, but really, really important subject. The topic of today's conversation is going to be the rise of white nationalist far-right extremist movements in this country, and in particular, what we've seen with the rise of the QAnon conspiracy theory movement, talking a little bit about what these movements are and where they've come from, how they have specifically targeted vulnerable communities in this country, including American Jews, and talking a little bit about how we, as a Jewish community, as a country, as progressives, what we can do to mobilize and fight back against these movements and understand them, and ultimately confront and defeat them. And to have this conversation, we're joined today by two phenomenal expert speakers on this topic, and we're really, really excited. So I'm just going to introduce them briefly before we'll give them an opportunity to share their own stories and experience of working on these issues. Senator Scott Wiener represents San Francisco and northern San Mateo County in the California State Senate. Elected in 2016, Senator Wiener focuses extensively on housing, transportation, civil rights, criminal justice reform, clean energy, and alleviating poverty. He chairs the Senate Housing Committee and is vice chair of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus. He's also the immediate past chair of the California Legislative LGBTQ Caucus. Before his election to the Senate, Senator Wiener served as a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, representing the district previously represented by Harvey Milk. He has an important and alarming personal story of being on the receiving end of QAnon's hateful conspiracy theories and attacks, which he will, of course, speak about with us today. Sophie Ellman-Golan is the director, recently named director, congratulations, Sophie, of strategic communications at Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, JFREJ, a New York-based Jewish political activism and organizing hub. Prior to joining the JFREJ staff, Sophie worked as a political and messaging strategist with a focus on anti-Semitism and white nationalism, helping to expose ties between far-right movements and elected officials. Before that, she served as the director of communications and digital outreach at the Women's March. As one of the national organizers of the Women's March on Washington, Sophie was named one of Glamour Magazine's 2017 Women of the Year, and she has appeared in many top national and media outlets over the past 4 years due to her work. So thanks both of you for joining us. It's really, really great to have you here. So I want to start by giving each of our speakers just an opportunity to say a little bit about your experiences working with this topic and facing down and confronting far-right, white nationalist, extremist conspiracy theory movements. And I want to start with Senator Wiener. You wrote a really compelling and amazing and in some ways horrifying New York Times piece about your experiences with QAnon. For those on this call who may not know the story, I was wondering if you could just start by sharing a little bit about your experience with this.
Yeah, so thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this. And sorry for my voice is a little weird. My allergies decided to emerge this morning, so I knew it was inevitable. Yeah, so I am a gay Jewish guy who represents San Francisco, and so that's like the holy trifecta for the right wing and. In many ways, and they, in terms of the homophobia and the anti-Semitism that is just percolating there constantly, the hatred of San Francisco, and because I represent San Francisco, I have a solemn obligation to push the envelope on not just progressive policies, but the really not very sexy and politically difficult progressive policies that only very few areas can have a representative who could have the political support to do that. So my first year in office in 2017 in the Senate, I authored California's HIV decriminalization law. And for the 3 years before I got there, the advocates couldn't even find an author to introduce that bill to get rid of these horrible felonies that were passed in the 80s and 90s to criminalize people living with HIV. And so we got that passed, and it was hard. And that's when the sort of the MAGA world first discovered me. And after Governor Jerry Brown signed that bill into law in late 2017, there was a tidal wave online of just horrific, like, hatred directed towards me, and that has lasted until today. But the other thing that I've worked on, again, being from San Francisco, only not that many of us can do this, is to reform California's broken sex offender registry. California had one of the most just horrific sex offender registries, punishing particularly so many gay men who were having sex in parks in the 1960s, and 50 years later are still on the sex offender registry. So we were able to do a massive reform of the registry in 2017. And then last year, and this is what triggered the QAnon tidal wave, California's sex offender registry treated LGBTQ young people more harshly than straight young people. So when you have situations where a college-age kid is having sex with a high school-age kid, which it's a crime, it's statutory rape, if you have basically vaginal intercourse, a 19-year-old with a 17-year-old, let's say, the judge did not have to put the person on does not have to put the person on the sex offender registry. It can say, this is not an abusive situation, this is a boyfriend-girlfriend situation, I'm not putting you on. Any other kind of intercourse, the judge was required to put the person on. And so that had an impact that the 19-year-old having sex with his 17-year-old boyfriend was forced to go on the registry, even if the judge didn't want to put the person on. And so I introduced legislation that had pretty broad support to say, let's just treat everyone the same way we treat the straight young people, that the judge can look at the facts of the case and decide if it was abusive or if it was not abusive, and whether to put the person on the sex offender registry, which of course can destroy your life. And especially imagine a 19-year-old having to go on for a minimum of 10 years onto the registry. People take their lives. It's just really bad. So it was a hard bill. We got it through. The politics were rough. And thank you to Governor Newsom for signing that into law. During the final few months of that process, and then after it was signed, I just got this tidal wave of QAnon vitriol. Tens of thousands. It started on Instagram, and that was the most intense, and then migrated onto Facebook, less so on Twitter. But then it was also spreading on YouTube and on all these different platforms, and we learned a lot about different social media platform responses. Tens of thousands of comments calling me a pedophile, all sorts of anti-Semitic comments, homophobic comments, and then thousands of private messages, again, mostly on Instagram, but some on Facebook, with, again, just saying horrific things, more than 1,000 death threats, threatening to, decapitate me and shit down my neck, down my throat, or I think send my decapitated head to my mother. I mean, just like literally over 1,000 like that. And they also at one point, even my dad like commented with a thumbs up or something on one of my Instagram posts, and someone responded to him, sort of realizing he was my dad. So we had to work with my parents to teach them how to scrub their home address from, these are my elderly parents. It's just really horrible. And we, provided all of those, the voicemails, the emails, the social media messages, gave it all to law enforcement. And someone is being actually prosecuted as a result, thankfully. But it was really scary. It was really, really scary. And the anti-Semitism and the homophobia around it was just, they weren't even embarrassed to be saying these things. So fortunately, it eventually died down, but it's still there lingering at a lower level.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And we will dig into different aspects of it, but I think just the, I think really bringing home there the very frightening and kind of severe nature of what it is that we're actually confronting. So thank you for sharing that, Senator. Sophie, do you want to say a little bit about your experience kind of on some of the front lines of these issues?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think Logan, you did a great job kind of sharing my background on this. I've spent the past about 2 years researching, tracking, and supporting progressive Jewish organizing against white nationalism and anti-Semitism and ties between far-right movements and Republican electeds. And QAnon became a pretty central part of that, given just the high level of anti-Semitism within the QAnon conspiracy theory, or it is modern day blood libel. And now I serve as the Director of Strategic Communications at Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. And a 30-year-old organization in New York City serves as the home for Jewish New Yorkers to organize alongside our neighbors and allies to fight for a city and state where every community has the freedom, opportunity, and resources to thrive. I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you. And thank you for your work. So, I wanted to start off by talking about, how do we talk about and think about this issue in the sense that because of some of the just extreme, fundamentally, frankly, almost, deranged nature of so much of what the far right says and believes. And we got a taste of how, just sort of vitriolic and vicious and insane it is in the senator's story. I think, some perhaps have been a little bit inclined to want to just not think about this or to want to dismiss it, at least up until recently, as just some sort of fringe crazies. It's a little bit hard to wrap your head around it. And I've also heard, the narrative that maybe these groups, what they really crave is attention. And so we shouldn't talk about them perhaps as much. That might be feeding into it. But on the other hand, it seems to me that the danger being posed here is very, very real. If we talk just about the type of harassment that public officials are subjected to, like Senator Wiener, and we can get into other stories. If we talk about obviously the threats of violence and the fact that in some cases these groups are linked to, actual people who have weapons and have engaged in violence or may engage in violence. Obviously, we saw what happened with the insurrection at the Capitol. As recently as early this month, we saw Congress actually suspend session for a day because there was rumors of potential QAnon plots against Congress on March 4th, which is a sort of important date for QAnon for reasons we don't necessarily have to get into. So the threat is very real. How do we start getting people to understand the nature of just sort of how widespread this is without exaggerating it? And I'd also be interested to hear you talk about how do we kind of differentiate between the sort of diehard believers pushing this stuff and some of the more or less normal people out there on social media channels who are, falling for these conspiracy theories or getting sucked into these narratives and becoming sort of agents of hate, maybe without originally realizing that that's what's going on. Sophie, I'll start with you. Go to the center.
Yeah, I think it's first important to ask why people are susceptible to these conspiracy theories, because you certainly have your grifters out there who, are monetizing essentially promoting the conspiracy theories. But, in many ways, I'd actually push back on the idea that we can sort of separate between true believers and quote unquote normal people, just simply because of how widespread the conspiracy is and sort of how many different demographics it's been embraced by. So really the question is, what makes people search out these conspiracy theories and grab onto them? And one of the big reasons is fear. People are afraid, confused, looking for a simple explanation for why everything is going wrong, why a handful of people have so much while others have so little. And those conditions, and particularly the conditions we've seen in the past year, are just ripe for the spread of, in particular, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories like QAnon. One thing I've seen over and over again has been that as newly politicized people kind of work to explain the contours of their oppression, they may very well find explanations offered by anti-Semitism compelling. And Eric Ward has written about this, that the right doesn't create bias, it simply organizes the bias that's already there. So there are not enough accessible places someone can go to learn why our society is so imbalanced, so racist, so oppressive, why monopoly consolidation is so intense. And QAnon provided not just an answer, but a community of people around that answer. And so when the pandemic hit and when people's fear exploded and our access to community went almost entirely online, QAnon was there. Now, I will say we have our own choices in how we respond to it. And I really cannot emphasize enough how important it is that we do so responsibly. You know, repeating conspiracies in order to deny them amplifies them, and repeating them without context is a huge problem. And I'll point to actually what happened when, in August, when Trump was asked about QAnon. I mean, researchers and journalists who've been tracking it collectively kind of groaned the moment we saw a reporter ask him about it, and first just describe it as a movement gaining a lot of followers, right? Omitting any detail or framing of it as something false and dangerous. And this was a gift to QAnon believers who remain fixated on looking for clues from Trump and his cronies of support for their movement. And now he was asked about it directly. It was thrilling for them. And even more so, of course, he predictably responded, you know, these are people who love our country, after noting that he understood they liked him very much. And then even worse, the reporter followed this up by characterizing QAnon believers as people who thought Trump was secretly saving the world from this satanic cult of pedophiles and cannibals. So that description provides absolutely zero incentive for Trump to distance himself from, and instead it invited him to say, is that supposed to be a bad thing? So the consequences of that exchange were, one, people who'd never heard of QAnon before looked it up, which inevitably brought more people into the movement. People who were already in the movement had their faith fortified. And finally, you know, I think it made QAnon sort of presented as a wild and silly conspiracy and not a dangerous movement with devastating impacts. And, you know, I mean, what the senator just described, these impacts are devastating. So just to quickly go back to your initial question, you know, I think we can't scoff at QAnon, and we really should, you know, certainly cannot laugh or mock people whose lives have been consumed by it. I mean, there are all these tragic stories of families ripped apart by someone falling into that rabbit hole and going deeper and deeper. But we also can't respond to sort of the moral panic that is QAnon with our own moral panic. We're all kind of living under a cloud of fear and anxiety, even if we differ on what we're afraid of. And fear is really narrowing, it's really reactive. So what I'd ask folks to do is breathe and take a beat before repeating something we hear that sounds really scary. You know, take a second, click on the article, read past the headline, because we're all susceptible, I think, to sharing things that confirm our beliefs. And finally, I'll say, you know, fighting this requires going to the root of the problem, the source of people's desperation. People need material things to survive. If we can make society more equitable, government more transparent, redistribute resources so power and opportunity aren't shrouded in mystery, that will make it harder for people to conjure their own realities around that mystery.
Well, I have seen, I do draw, it's a spectrum, but somewhat of a distinction between the truly malicious, you know, folks and the folks who get sucked in. So like when we look at the anti-vaxxer movement, which there is now some real overlap there, talking about conspiracies and counterfactual narratives, you have the truly malicious anti-vaxxers who spread information, who, you know, it's just horrific what they do, and they're doing it with COVID denialism now. And then you have people who they just see a whole bunch of stuff on their social media feed, and maybe some friends are talking about it, and they get sucked into it, and it just they start to believe it. And so with QAnon, you have people who are otherwise normal, you know, just normal regular people, who they all of a sudden start seeing these articles, quote unquote, that are malicious. That just, you know, we saw this around our legislation with titles like California's legalizing pedophilia. I mean, just made up stuff. And people start, the malicious people generate it and put it out there, or they make a horrible YouTube video, and then regular people see it, and they see things over and over. Oh my God, there's a pedophilia, tidal wave happening in our country. All this pedophilia everywhere. And pedophilia, of course, you know, there is pedophilia and it's horrific crime, but, you know, making it seem like there's just this massive network of people engaged in pedophilia, and then they start believing it. And whether it's because of just some people are gullible, some people are desperate, some people are just looking for community to latch onto. They're looking for an explanation of all the things that are wrong in the world. There's all these bad things happening in the world. Well, maybe this is an explanation. that these politicians are just all focused on pedophilia. And so and what we found was when we would, and God bless my communications director, Kay Stewart, who would go through all of these unending social media messages. And for the ones that were not just truly horrible, but the people who would message and be like, oh my God, how could you do this? How could you legalize pedophilia? This is terrible. I'm so upset. And we would send them a fact check, because there were very AP and USA Today, various outlets did fact checks on the claims being made against the law, that showing that they were false. We would send that to people, and more people than you would expect would respond back and say, oh my God, that's what the bill does? I totally support that. That's about equality for LGBT people. That's not what I heard before. Thank you for responding. And so there is a real spectrum of people, and there are people who can be pulled back. Others can't, and it is really horrific. I agree with Sophie. I've heard since my New York Times piece came out, the number of people who have come up to me and said, yeah, I have an aunt or a cousin or whoever, or a parent who we can't really talk anymore because they've gone down this rabbit hole and we just can't deal with it anymore.
Yeah, I wanted to just ask specifically, on the topic of, why so many of these conspiracy theories are centering around this concept of, of pedophilia, or of targeting to children, because, and you've talked and written about this really compellingly, Senator. It seems to me that part of what's going on there is that, because it's a pretty much universal sentiment that people love and care about children and don't want to see them harmed. And, pedophilia is, the idea of it is something that inspires so much revulsion. There is a desire to, to weaponize and spread that label and accusations of such a horrible, kind of appalling crime, attach it to, LGBT leaders, Democratic politicians like yourself, the Democratic Party writ large, or the progressive movement writ large, in a way that really is designed to dehumanize, right? So that people don't see their political adversaries as someone they disagree with politically or has a different view with them, but really that they were to look at someone like Senator Wiener, or look at someone like Congressman Tom Malinowski, for example, in New Jersey, faced similar, attack ads painting him as somehow supportive of pedophilia, to try to turn people into monsters. And if someone's a monster, not a person, you can do pretty much anything you want to them. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that, and also how that, how that ties to, Sophie, you brought up the concept of blood libel. Senator, in your op-ed in the New York Times, you spoke about the story of Leo Frank and the sort of history of specifically targeting Jews with this sort of myth of Jews as people who attack children, or gay people attacking children. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, yeah, two things. There's a long, first there's a long history of moral panics around pedophilia, and there are various examples in history of just things being made up, accusations that destroy people's lives. There was the one decades ago around the school in Massachusetts or Connecticut, but specifically historically, Jews stealing Christian children, wanting the blood of Christian children, like the whole that they're going to steal or harm our children is a theme throughout history, and those charges have been leveled against Jews for centuries, millennia. And for LGBTQ people, and particularly, let's be clear, gay men, there's a long history of gay men are pedophilies. They're coming for your children. They're coming for your boys. They're perverts. They're going to go after, try to get your children to have sex with, to recruit, etc. And so we have to protect our kids against these, perverted, predatory gay men. If you are a gay man in politics and elected office, at some point, it's just a matter of time. At some point in your career, you will be called a pedophile. You just will. And it's happened going back to Harvey Milk. And it happens to all of us. And it's just, unfortunately, it's a really tragic and horrific occupational hazard that at some point someone's going to say it. So I skated for a long time, and eventually they came at me.
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly. these conspiracies aren't new, they're just repackaged. And I think what you were just referencing was part of also the satanic panic from the 1980s. That was,
Right.
you know, another iteration of this. And it's part of why they're easily digestible, because people have heard some vague version of them before, right? I mean, it goes back to even, you know, medieval Christian lore. And what I would say is, I also think there's an angle of this that you know, embedded in QAnon is sort of the intersection of white supremacy, patriarchy, and homophobia. So it's a staple of white supremacy to present men of color and, yeah, white Jewish men as sexual predators preying on Anglo-Saxon women and girls. You know, the KKK tried to justify the lynching of Black men by claiming they'd raped white women. The fear and fetishizing of non-white sexuality is in many ways a cornerstone of white supremacy. And that still happens today. White people lose it whenever there's a story about a Black or brown man sexually assaulting a white woman. Every time we see right-wing media latch onto these stories of an undocumented immigrant assaulting a white woman. You know, we see the same stories in media outlets about Muslim immigrants in Western Europe. It's all the same narrative. And that same demonizing of male immigrants actually happened when there was an influx of men immigrating from Eastern Asia to the West Coast. The anti-miscegenation crowd responded to interracial relationships by pushing this narrative of Asian men as weak, as not masculine. So this has happened over and over again. I mean, back in Nazi Germany, you saw, you know, propaganda was created and spread about deviant Jewish men seeking to pervert the Aryan race by raping white women. So time and again, you know, we see this vilification of non-Christian, you know, non-white men as sexual deviants, and using that as justification for violence against racialized groups, and also for controlling women's sexuality. And of course, as a side note, rape and sexual assault, like all violent crime, is predominantly intra-racial, not interracial. But this is, you know, this is something we see over and over again. And of course, you know, as the senator mentioned, there's a history involving also, you know, a legal history of presenting gay men as perverts, conflating homosexuality with pedophilia. And I think, again, this history is part of what makes it also salient, but it's also what it's, you know, I mean, it's, again, the legacy is just, it's harm after harm after harm. So much violence and harm is justified in the name of this.
So first of all, I want to remind folks, and I put in the chat that you can submit questions for the panelists, and we won't be able to get to all of them, but we do have a few coming in that I will get a chance to ask in just a minute. I wanted to first, though, pick up on, you know, Sophie, I mean, what you sort of got at there is, you know, a lot of the tropes that these movements are drawing on, I think we also see amplified at the level of ostensible, sort of more mainstream, official, conservative / Republican politics, right? I mean, we saw so many of the election campaigns of the 2020 and the 2018 midterms predicated on the idea of targeting and demonizing minorities, the outside and alien threat of immigrants or other sort of dangerous others coming to destroy the country, and sometimes the allegation that Jews were sort of puppeteering that process, wealthy Jewish people or billionaires puppeteering that process. That has became fairly mainstream, certainly in the rhetoric of President Trump, if not from others. I'm wondering if you could comment, either of you, on the impact of that, and also sort of the converse, which is seeing some of these more really extreme ideas from QAnon and some of these tropes about pedophilia. To what extent have some of these things actually been echoed by more mainstream Republican politicians? Not just, I think, the folks are aware of, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, sort of more active, maybe QAnon believers in some ways coming into Congress, but even sort of more mainstream Republican channels. It seems to me that's part of the most dangerous threat here, is when you have major national political figures actually sort of winking at these movements and these ideas, to thinking that they can use them or energize them to attack their opponents without wholeheartedly or fully adopting their messaging or their rhetoric.
Yeah, so it has definitely, spread in a couple ways. We see, having to have a scapegoat to rile people up we're seeing it again with the Republican attacks on trans children, and that's the whole other thing in terms of demonization and similar to what Sophie was saying about the whole notion that white women are in danger because of men of color. That trans people are dehumanized, and basically the narrative is they don't really exist. So if a trans woman is going to use a women's restroom, that must mean that it's really a guy who's pretending to be a woman in order to rape women in that restroom. Never mind that a guy, like if a guy was going to do that, most restrooms aren't locked, group restrooms. You can just go in and they could do it if they were going to commit that crime. You don't have to go through the dressing up. So it's a nonsensical argument to begin with. There's no evidence that it actually happens. These are just trans women who want to use the women's restroom. And so we're seeing it now with trans kids and competing in sports, and it's a constant series. But in terms of politicians, Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene are only the most obvious. And I actually had two colleagues of my Republican colleagues in the state Senate who were really repeating QAnon lies about my legislation on the floor of the Senate when we debated it, and then on Twitter afterwards. And then I had a colleague, and that bill, it was a hard bill if you weren't like a lefty Democrat. And we actually had some moderate Democrats from hard districts who stood up and supported it and even spoke for it. And we even had some couple of Republicans that voted for it, including the former Republican leader who's now an independent because he was so sick of the party, he left it. And he voted for and spoke passionately for it, and about how he had called his local district attorney who said he should support it because it's a fair bill. And he was up for re-election, and his Republican opponent, the Republican Party, viciously attacked him and sent out mailers basically saying that he was legalizing pedophilia. And so, it's really just, it's really tragic how this plays out and how you have these mainstream Republican leaders who start repeating these lies.
Yeah, I mean, it went beyond just, it went beyond California State Senate also. I remember, because I was tracking at the congressional level, in early September, Senator Ted Cruz and Donald Trump Jr. both joined in actually on the smears against Senator Wiener. Cruz shared a tweet from a right-wing account. The senator's face was the main image of it, and he outrageously claimed that Democrats believed, quote, "we need more adults having sex with children." That same day, Donald Trump Jr. shared a Fox News article that said, and he said Democrats were, quote, "pandering to the wishes of pedophiles and child rapists." I also think this is a quick aside, but the moral panic over the Netflix documentary Cuties, which folks may or may not remember, also I think gave Republicans an opportunity to solicit QAnon support without kind of looking like conspiracy theorists. And that's the thing. There's a reason we don't hear more forceful denouncement of QAnon from the Republican Party. And it's because the party has decided that this is a valuable voting bloc they don't want to alienate. Politicians who I would bet privately know it's a bananas conspiracy theory have publicly flirted with aspects of it to attract voters. And another example, is from former Senator Kelly Loeffler's campaign against now Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock. She ran an openly white supremacist campaign that just, made outrageous accusation after accusation. And one of the last ditch efforts she made was adopting a talking point, falsely accusing him of child abuse. So 3 days before the runoff, she told a crowd at a campaign stop that Harvey Weinstein's lawyer contributed to Warnock's campaign. He hadn't. She said, "I don't think that's a coincidence." She kept repeating these accusations around child abuse at a summer camp he worked at. These were things that were completely debunked, but it was, again, part of this issue of, can she get the QAnon supporters to rally behind her if she tells the story that the scary Black man she's running against is actually a child abuser and a pedophile and maybe connected to Harvey Weinstein in some way. It's a political tactic.
Well, she also in the primary, when she had Doug Collins running as well, she was able to get Marjorie Taylor Greene's endorsement, and they made a big deal of that endorsement. And so that's an example. I don't know Kelly Loeffler, I have no desire to know her, but my understanding is she didn't necessarily come from that extreme right background. She's more of a business kind of Republican, but she basically sold her soul by, you know, associating herself with Marjorie Taylor Greene and with QAnon. And that's again, it's just like with regular people, with politicians, there are some who are true believers, and that's horrible. But there are others who make a very calculated decision to associate themselves with just an out there conspiracy theory that is so harmful. And it is so harmful. I mean, I just want to say, I mean, I got all these death threats, I got doxxed, I got all, but you know, I'm an elected official, right? I have a platform, I can publicize things, I can, you know, we can work with California Highway Patrol as I get death threats, I get, you know, but for the vast majority of people targeted by QAnon, they're people whose names you've never heard before. They don't have access to the resources that I have. They don't have the public platform that I have, but they're getting doxxed, they're getting threatened, and their lives are getting upended in many cases. And the Kelly Loefflers of the world, because they have no soul, just are all in because they'll do anything to get elected. And we're seeing that not from everyone in the Republican Party, but from far too many Republican candidates.
So I think we've done a pretty good job, you know, sort of diagnosing what this threat actually is and what it looks like. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the questions that we're receiving from the audience are sort of about what we can then do to respond and to fight it. So there's a few different questions that I wanted to explore that have been submitted from the audience. I think to start with, I wanted to talk about, you know, are there any sort of specific responses in terms of how we identify and respond to perhaps sort of the leaders or the worst inciters of this movement? And I specifically want to ask, you know, both of you, what do you think the best strategies are for confronting sort of the leading orchestrators of this? And what is the role or not role that you envision for federal and state or local legislation or legal activity on this, or law enforcement activity? Because I know, you know, especially in a lot of communities on the left, there's also understandable concerns about, you know, the role that can sometimes be played by law enforcement, and that role sometimes being unhelpful or problematic in itself. So, you know, for the folks who are really the worst offenders, when we're talking about actual, you know, death threats and some of the things that you face, Senator Wiener, what are the actual sort of tactical and or legal responses that you'd like to see?
Well, we need to, I mean, the social media platforms need to be more accountable. And I'll just tell you our experience, the most proactive platform, and so this is where we had the fewest issues, was Twitter. Twitter was actually quite aggressive immediately about dealing with this. The worst was YouTube. And YouTube, of course, is known for, you know, you watch one video and then you just go, it just recommends more and more of the same. And there were some terrible ones on YouTube. They were really difficult to deal with in terms of getting some of them taken down. Instagram, Facebook was sort of in the middle. Early on, we were really struggling. The woman who doxed me, we went to her account, her entire Instagram account. She had like, I don't know, 40, 50,000 followers. Her entire account was a doxing account. It was a QAnon account, it was a doxing account. And we were like, how on earth does this account still exist? She didn't do it once, she did it like dozens of times. And then she would post screenshots of messages, someone would report her. She got a message from Instagram saying, you know, tisk tisk, you're violating the rules. You may get taken down if you keep doing this. And she would just screenshot and post them, just like bragging about how, you know, she was still able to do this. And so we really, like, you know, really got loud about her. And I got loud about her on Twitter. And then her account got taken down, but we realized she had like 10 other accounts. Instagram makes it all but impossible to report a message that you receive. You can report like a post or an account, but if you get a message that is abusive or death threat, there's no like way that I've been able to figure out that you can just quickly report that message. And so it was, a problem. I know Facebook got aggressive at some point in taking down a bunch of accounts, and that's good. These accounts that are intentionally spreading misinformation, that are doxing, threatening, need to just go.
And Senator, could you just clarify, just for some in our audience who may not know, what doxing is?
Oh, doxing is when someone discloses your personal information online. It could be your social security number, your home address, your cell phone number, your where you work, or information about your family. It can be a variety of things. In my case, she disclosed my home address. An obvious signal: go and kill him. This is where he lives.
Yeah, it's specifically primarily information that is not typically publicly available as well. So, right. I think, like, for example, if there's an anonymous account and it's someone's name, it's not, there are things that, but yeah, that's what it is. And also, I just want to say, Senator, I'm so sorry that this happened and was done to you. And I mean, you're absolutely right in terms of noting, the relative platform that you have versus other people who are targeted by this and have no recourse, no public profile to be able to push back against it. And I mean, I think you stated perfectly, how derelict a lot of these social media platforms have been in their responsibility to do so. You mentioned the algorithm that, pushes people to get deeper and deeper into these conspiracy theories who are brought into it more and more. I'd also say that Instagram is a particularly dangerous sort of platform for this, because you've seen a lot of sort of mommy bloggers and lifestyle influencers become creatures of QAnon. And they're folks who we wouldn't necessarily think of as, part of the far right or part of conspiracy theorists. It's kind of part of where the anti-vaxxer overlap comes in. Jewish Currents actually had a great article about that that I can post later. But in terms of sort of what we can do, particularly on a federal and state level, I mean, overall, I'd say we need, a multi-pronged approach that uses existing tools of government as well as structural reforms. And I'd go back to, what I said earlier. In part of, I think, getting to the root of these issues involves dealing with why are people feeling desperation. Obviously, that will not counteract everyone, and it certainly won't counteract the malicious people that Senator Wiener has described, but it will, I think, help counteract, part of what makes people so ripe and prime for absorbing these conspiracy theories. So on the federal level, I know Bend the Arc Jewish Action, in partnership with Muslim Advocates, the Arab American Institute, and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, they're calling on the Biden administration to address a few things to deal with hate violence against our communities and harassment. And the first is white nationalist infiltration of law enforcement. We've seen this. It's been a known problem for a long time. This is one of the things that I do. I don't track white nationalists in law enforcement specifically, but I know of multiple white nationalists who hold government positions right now, still left over from the Trump administration as well. So getting these folks out of positions of power is really important, because they use those positions of power, whether it's kind of by planting Easter eggs or by pushing actual policy. The second is updating old and disproven theories of radicalization that disproportionately target communities of color. So we've seen this push from some organizations for more legislation around anti-terrorism and domestic terrorism. And it's pretty clear when we look at sort of how those bills, how similar pieces of legislation have been implemented in the past, that where that will fall and who will be targeted by that will be Muslim communities, will be Black and Brown communities, and not as targeted, against the people who are engaging in sort of these acts of terror. Finally, I know that on the federal level, there's a call to pass the No Hate Act. So that's also a piece of legislation that could be moving. On the local level, my organization, JFREG, is part of a coalition called NYC Against Hate. And our coalition calls for a number of evidence-based initiatives that have simply never been invested in at scale. Things like data and reporting projects, community-based intervention, restorative justice programs. And we're of the opinion that what we don't need are more carceral approaches. Increased penalties don't stop hate violence. That's why, there's this argument of using existing methods that exist in government instead of creating kind of new ones. And finally, investing in the social safety net, housing and shelter, mental health services, effective substance use treatment. These do not feel often like they are ways to combat a conspiracy theory. And I think it's hard, particularly because they're certainly not immediate fixes either. But if we're talking about what gets to the root of some of these problems and the root of where sort of violence stems from, that's, very much what we believe is the solution.
And I think also, and this is a really hard one, it's sort of the state of the media today, and the fact that in terms of where people are getting information, so many media outlets are not where they need to be, or not either, or closing. A lot of local media is closing, and and so much media now, if you're online, there's like paywalls. If you're not a subscriber, you can't even read it. And so people are less likely to get their information from these actual media outlets, and they just see whatever random blog link someone posts as an article, and they're not seeing the actual reporting. And so that's a problem.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, Huffington Post, controlled by BuzzFeed, just laid off so many dozens of reporters, including some excellent reporters who have been on the disinformation beat, who are now without jobs and not able to continue that critical reporting. And when it comes to the far right media platforms, you have a lot of outlets that will kind of buy domain names that sound legitimate, right? Like I think one is like the Colorado Guardian or something like that. It sounds like, oh, that's probably maybe a Colorado focused version of the Guardian, right? It's not. And apologies if I'm getting that name wrong, but I think that that's what it is. But so you see multiple outlets that do this, and that's part of people monetizing the conspiracy theories in a malicious way. But we're also living in such a divided moment where we're living in fundamentally different realities, and I don't really actually have an answer for that, of how we combat the fact that the people who watch Fox News and OAN and Newsmax, that's what they watch. And those of us who watch MSNBC and read, the New York Times, that's what we consume. And we're living in we have really different understandings of what's happening around us as a result.
Well, and the right-wing media has just gone so far over the cliff that now the fact that Fox News got attacked for actually declaring Joe Biden the victory. But actually, of note, in the legislation that I talked about earlier, that I got attacked for, early on in that legislation, there started to be some percolating of misinformation. And actually, Fox News published an online article accurately describing the bill, and it sort of ended it for a while. And then later on, other outlets, quote unquote, really just started spreading lies. So it's as terrible as Fox News is, it's like not even close to being the worst anymore. So it's a huge problem.
So thank you both so much for those really compelling responses. And I think they got some of the questions that we've been getting about the roles also of funding for mental health support, sort of broader social justice initiatives that we can do to help sort of strengthen our communities against this kind of thing. I did want to close just on a question, specifically about what we should be doing as American Jews and sort of the Jewish element of this. I think obviously, the past 4 years have been a really frightening time for so many vulnerable communities in our country, including the American Jewish community. I think that the kind of, conversation about anti-Semitism has always been something that's present in our community, obviously as a threat going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. But it's obviously in the American Jewish community become elevated, and it's something that's on a lot of our minds. When we specifically just sort of look at the response, the organized response of what we should be doing and how we should be mobilizing as American Jews, what do you both see as sort of the specific role of our community, and how can we best be working with other vulnerable communities? And obviously, some of those communities overlap with our own, as we have, LGBTQ American Jews and Jewish Americans of color. How can we all sort of be, working across communities to actually make ourselves safer and make others safer?
I would just say that there's a reason, it's not random, why last I checked, the two highest percentage voting groups for Democrats are Black people and Jewish people, and LGBTQ people as well. And that's because we know you, we know who you are. It didn't take Donald Trump to tell us who you are. And our lives are literally at risk with you in power. That I was taught early on, as a Jewish child, that you have to vote, you have to be engaged, you have to know what's going on, because voting isn't just who's going to do the best job, fixing the streets or whatever. It's about it can be about whether we live or die. And the same is true with LGBTQ people, same is true of people of color, and immigrants. It's we know, and sort of we see you, and we know who you are, and we know what you want to do, and we know who you are behind the mask that you put on. And so I think as Jews, we need to also given the history, when we have, it was really damaging, if I could just get a little, more political here, this unholy alliance between Donald Trump and Netanyahu, which was, and the moving of the embassy and all the things that Trump did to try to say, come on, Jews, come into our fold, come into our fold. It's no, you have Nazis in your fold. You said that they're good people. You're not for us. And we need to make sure that as a Jewish community, we're as united as we can be, understanding we have political diversity in our community, and that's okay. But to be clear, that is not for our community, because that is the party right now that has Nazis in it. That is the party that has white supremacists in it. That is the party that has QAnon. That's the party that goes after us and has, in different forms gone after us for thousands of years. And so we need to be very clear and vocal about that.
Really well put.
Yeah, Sophie. True. As my leftist self is also wanting to say, of course, Democrats are not necessarily going to be anyone's salvation. Of course, we know. Biden administration is still deporting immigrants right now, but yeah, I completely agree in terms of where the actual neo-Nazis are. There is not a competition there. There should be no confusion about that. And when it comes to taking anti-Semitism seriously and understanding where it sort of poses the greatest risk, where it has the most access to power and is being implemented both on a policy level and in rhetoric that's coming from the RNC alone. We should be very clear about where that is. We should focus our energy accordingly. I'll just say, the fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene got so little attention during her primary, while you have groups like the Democratic Majority for Israel that invested so much energy in failed primary challenges against Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and efforts to go, to try to keep Eliot Engel in office. And you have someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene who skated by largely unnoticed, eventually got to run unopposed in a general election. And that a lot of that has to do with where we prioritize our energy, where we see threats coming from, and where we're willing to put our noise, our dollars, and our attention.
Great. Thank you both for those comments. I think if I could just summarize some of what we've heard from you today, it's that this is a very serious threat that we need to be confronting as a community and as a society, as a country. We want to confront it head on, and we also want to understand the ways which you two have spoken about so compellingly, that it's linked to historical tropes and movements that have been here for a long time, and that it's also linked to broader unhealthiness in our country, in our society, and broader issues that we need to fight and address. That this kind of dangerous extremist threat is in some ways a symptom of broader problems with our politics that we all need to be working on. And I just want to remind everyone, just as Senator Wiener and Sophie and Jay Frederick are committed to, J Street is committed to that work and that fight. I wanted to remind people that we have our national conference coming up in April. As you'll see on the screen, it's going to be our first ever and hopefully only virtual national conference, April 18th to 19th. And we're going to be discussing a wide range of topics, both on, sort of J Street's core issues, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and diplomacy and the JCPOA and the Iran deal, as well as questions of Jewish progressive organizing, intersectional organizing, fighting white nationalism, combating anti-Semitism, and a lot of the themes that were discussed here today. And we will have great speakers of the caliber or close to the caliber of Senator Wiener and Sophie Ellman-Golan. So I just wanted to encourage you, it's jstreet.org/conference to register today to attend that. And other than that, I just want to really thank everyone for joining in and thank our participants, our panelists so much for sharing really personal and difficult and complex stories and how you've been working to help make our community safer and really stand up for our core Jewish democratic progressive values. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.